Thank you. And we're going to get started now with our third panel discussion of the day. And the topic of this panel is what's the future of space launch? This has been a hot issue in recent years in Congress. And it's going to be one of the big space issues that the new administration is going to have to tackle. So I want to briefly introduce the panelists here today. We've got to my left is Andrew Hunter, who's a senior fellow here at CSIS. And then we've got Bill LaPlante, who is at the MITRE Corporation, formerly the acquisition chief in the Air Force. We have John Schumacher, who's joining us from Aerojet Rocketdyne, and on the end here is Brett Alexander from Blue Origin. You'll notice that there are a couple of companies here that have something at stake in the future of U.S. space launch. I also am going to take the opportunity to make a shameless plug for two reports that we are releasing here today at CSIS that both Andrew and I worked on. And they both have to do with space launch. One is on what would the implications be for the military if the cost of access to space went down dramatically in the future. And so I'd encourage you, if that's an issue that's of interest to you, to take a look at that report. The second report that we're releasing today is entitled Beyond the RD-180. Of course, the RD-180 is the Russian rocket motor that's currently used on the Atlas V. That has been subject of a lot of controversy in Congress in recent years. Restrictions placed on the engine, how many can be used. The general consensus that's come out of this, of course, is that the U.S. wants to break its dependence on the Russian rocket motor. The question is how quickly and what are the options to transition. So that's what we explore in that paper. So without any more introduction, I want to go to Andrew and go to you first. And I'm going to have you talk a little bit about the reports that we released today. In particular, as the U.S. is trying to transition away from use of the RD-180 engine, how does it need to change the way it acquires space launch, and what are the different acquisition strategies that should be considered?
Well, thanks, Todd. Thanks for the opportunity to talk about our reports. And thanks also for letting me talk about acquisition strategies for space immediately before before the former Air Force Assistant Secretary, and putting him within arm's reach. So
that's right.
He can reach over and strangle me. Well, one of the interesting things that came out of the work that we were able to do on this is just what a interesting and tumultuous, if you will, disruptive time space launch is undergoing right now. And when I'm not talking to a space crowd, when I'm not talking to a crowd of more general interest in defense, I always like to say, if there's one thing that's been proved, if you can disrupt the space launch market, then there truly is no market that cannot be disrupted. And I think that's true. And it, of course, in this audience, the important point is that the space market is being disrupted. And that's an important point. So as you look at the future of space launch from a U.S. government perspective, you have to keep in mind that there's this broader trend that's going on in the world and the industry and globally is very significant. Now, it does present some real opportunities, and we're already starting to realize some of that. You're seeing cheaper launch as kind of a first effect, and you see that with the two launches that have been awarded so far to SpaceX that are at price points that are below with ones in recent history that the U.S. government has obtained. There's the opportunity for much more responsive launch, which is a big potential advantage. And as was discussed by the last panel, you start to see the potential for some new missions from space that would not be possible if launch costs didn't come down. And I think some of those ideas that the last panel talked about could potentially be enabled by what's happening in the launch market. When you talk about how do we get there? What are the acquisition strategy approaches that might get you there? I think there's a lot of things that the government is going to have to consider, has been considering, is going to have to continue to consider as it adopts its plan forward. And the first one is a really basic one that I think tends to get overlooked, and it's, well, what are we actually trying to buy? And I think the temptation when you think about launch, you say, well, we're buying rockets, right? I mean, that's what this is all about, rockets, isn't it? But it isn't, actually. What we're buying, generally speaking, is a service, and that's what the law says we're supposed to do. And in most cases, I think we definitely set out in that direction, but then you get into this question of, well, what kind of engine does my service have? Well, services don't have engines, right? So we constantly get back into talking about the rocket. But going forward in the future, as the market continues to mature and develop, and I think it is maturing and developing very rapidly, we really are, I think, going to be buying a service. And when we talk about reusability, that's definitely going to drive us more in that service perspective. And that's a different kind of an acquisition strategy than the strategy that says I'm trying to build and fly a rocket. It also talks about what market are you in and who else is in that market and affecting what your strategy might need to be. And we've seen this before in space. You know, the space acquisition strategies of the 90s said there's going to be a commercial market, we're going to ride along with that commercial market. When that commercial market didn't fully materialize, it affected the government strategy. To give another example, in a kind of a related field, the government at one point set out and said, we're going to develop software-definable radios for the military. They set out to do that. They set up a very extensive framework for that, and then along came things like the iPhone and commercial communications, which no one, first of all, had on their radar screen would exist when the government designed this program. But secondly, even when they started to see this market develop, they probably didn't think to themselves, well, this is going to completely change the way I need to think about my approach to government radios. And in fact, that is what happened, though. It did in many ways affect the government program. Third consideration is, you know, how much competition is right for the approach that we're going to take, which is really going to be informed by how much competition is possible, how much competition is out there, how much can we rely on non-traditional suppliers or people who may have some interest in the government market, but it's not really their focus. How much competition with that part of the market can you allow into the government system? But also the flip side of that. If you don't give yourself access to the commercial developments that are out there, do you end up with a set of government systems that are just, you know, dinosaurs that are completely disconnected from the broader technology space? So that's a careful balance. And then that gets to the question of risk. And what kind of risks, as the government's developing its acquisition strategy, is the government willing to take, and how does it manage them? And then that gets to probably some options. So one of the things we looked at in our report on that's entitled Beyond the RD-180 is what options might the government consider as it thinks about where it's going with the next generation of space systems. And there's a strategy in place to do public-private partnerships with some companies to develop some new capabilities and potentially some new competitors in the government launch space. But when and if, and assuming that we get to the point where we have those, again, how much competition do we want to have between them? How many competitors are we willing to entertain and or to help support and sponsor? And so we talk about some different approaches to the acquisition strategy. The first one that we discussed just briefly is the issue of the block buy, and we know that that's possible because we're in it now. We have one, we have a block buy, and then we have some competition along with that. And so that's one possibility. I think in the future, you would not, again, have a block buy that was uncompetitive. You would have a competitive contract that you would do, and then you would consider, is there some competition outside of that we would also engage in? The second approach is to do it more the way, and the classic case to me is the way that the Navy procures destroyers, which is to say they know they want to have two shipyards that build destroyers, and they compete between them, but they compete in a pretty low-key way, because everyone in the system understands that neither one is going to be allowed to go out of business, and so they're kind of competing for market share more than they're competing for existence or competing in a true head-to-head fashion, winner-takes-all fashion. And so if the government's objective in the future is to have two launch providers that can take it anywhere it wants to go, you can envision doing an approach like that. I call that allocated competition. Another approach then is to say, all right, well, that may be great, but again, those two government providers could end up looking like Navy shipyards, i.e. they sell only to the Navy. And that may be not what we want in space. And so we may have something that I term in the paper, very inelegant acquisition-y word, IDIQ competition, which is another way of saying competition that is more open, more competitors can get in, but you want to make sure that your competitors are viable, and so you're going to give some minimum awards within launch, but potentially you're going to have more than two people in play. And so you have more competitors, small guarantees, small contracts, but you have a more defined playing field. And then the logical end conclusion is something that's just full and open competition, where anyone can come to the party, anyone can play. No one gets any guarantee that their business will be of any magnitude. And my own view is that we're probably not in a space where the market's mature enough yet to allow that, but that could easily be the end objective in an ideal world where we'd be going.
All right. So next, Bill, I want to go to you. And you were, when you were acquisition chief in the Air Force, you were right in the middle of a lot of changes that were happening with the Evolved Expendable Launch Vehicle program. And so I wanted to get your thoughts on the EELV acquisition strategy. And in particular, what do you think is the proper balance between trying to reduce costs and trying to reduce risk, in particular maintaining assured access to space?
Yeah, thanks, Todd, and thanks, Andrew. And I didn't tell either of them, but I'm also announcing an article today that's going to rebut Andrew and what he said.
Thank you.
No, I'm kidding.
We'll put it on our website.
We'll put it on the CSIS website. Thanks for the question. So just remind everybody, not to get acquisition techie here, that we're in the beginning competitive phases of space launch outside the block buy. And I think it was recently announced by the Air Force that they're going to have as many as 15 competitive launches in this phase. And I think the second one was just announced with the GPS-3, which is the Falcon 9. The long-term plan, of course, is to get to what Andrew said. Everybody agrees. The actually interesting thing, everybody agrees on the long term. You don't get a whole lot of difference. Everybody wants something like launch as a service, leverage commercial, two independent at least ways to get into space, and do it with domestic U.S. technology. You don't have a whole lot of arguments about it. You can find people in space that will argue with you on that, but that's only because there's a lot of people in space that just like to argue. But generally, that's what you want. What the problem you have is you have the problem like in math or physics where you have a set of constraints and a number of equations. And the number of equations and the number of unknowns have to equal each other. And if you have fewer equations than unknowns, you're not going to solve the problem. And here's the thing. If you say where we are today to get to that nirvana that I just described, you sort of have to say, well, okay, we want competition. We want off the Russian engines, and we want to have an ability to tap into the commercial market. And the thing is in the next 5 years, probably you're not going to get any of those. And that's a very, very hard fact to realize. So to get to the acquisition strategy, the challenge, I'll get right to it, the challenge in the competitive phase that we're in right now, these guys are dealing with on one side, is you've got a situation where you have two certified offers, that is SpaceX and ULA, okay? And so far we've done 2 competitive launches, but we're going to have 13 more. And essentially because they're both certified, the source selection criteria ends up coming down largely to a few risk items that are specific to that launch and something called price. Somebody could argue that's an LPTA way of doing acquisition, and I'm not sure that that's not wrong. Because here's the argument on the other side of it. Are you going to put companies through 2 years of certification, launch at least 3 times, all types of stuff, a lot of it's on their own nickel, and then say, oh, by the way, now in a source selection, we're going to go through another year of looking at the risk in your proposal? That's sort of the dilemma that the government is in. And this gets at, for Andrew's IDIQ contract idea, which is a great idea. Think about how far would you have to go to certify the people to get into that pool to be an IDIQ provider? So again, this is the dilemma that we're in. And I would say that the price points are going to be the discriminator in the next 3 years. And the only other comment I would make on the acquisition strategy, which is something that I struggled with, and I'm not sure if we've publicly talked about this, is when you put a source selection together, you try to say, what is the ultimate value that you're going to reward? What is the value you're going to reward? Well, sometimes the value you want is, number one, risk. You know, you want the lowest risk. But keep in mind, the risk here, once you're through the certification process, it's hard to argue one is more risky than the other, right? Because you've gone through this, both have gone through this certification process. So the next thing, which we have not done, is you could say, what is the risk to the schedule? Particularly for the national security launches that are not GPS 3. We just had an NRO launch, NRO 79 is what we called it. It was very critical that that happened within 2 years of the award of the RFP. I remember when we awarded, I was still in the job. So one could put source selections together saying, okay, we're going to look at the cost, we're going to look at the technical risk, but since both guys are qualified, maybe that's going to be a wash. But if the schedule is important, we think that the risk is higher on that one than this one, and motivate that. The other comment I'll make, and then I'll stop, is I've convinced that we have to go to what's called, I called it allocation. It's the Navy Yard thing that Andrew said. I think there's no other way. Because again, we have this dilemma. We want to get the Russian engines. We want to at least two companies that are certified and survive that can put into space. And we want competition. I don't think you can't get two of those three, and I'm concerned you can't get one of those three unless you do something like an allocated launch. So those are my thoughts.
All right. And before I go to our industry participants on the panel here, I'd note that current U.S. policy on space launch is that we're supposed to have 2 independent vehicles capable of launching the full range of national security payloads. Now, we haven't really been following that for a while, but we're on the cusp of a situation where we will have that. And in our report, one of the things we presumed is that SpaceX and their family of Falcon vehicles will be one of those. With the Falcon 9 already certified, and the Falcon Heavy should be certified if all goes well within the next couple of years. So assuming that's one family, you need another family that's capable, at least one, of launching all the national security payloads. Right now, it's Atlas 5 and Delta 4, but we're trying to get rid of the RD-180 on the Atlas 5. The Atlas 5 is already not price competitive with the Falcon 9. We've seen that in a competition now. Delta 4 actually costs even more than an Atlas 5. So how do we get that second family that is going to be competitive and be able to launch the full range of payloads? So the question then becomes, what is that launch vehicle? Is it a modified Atlas 5, or is it a new vehicle, and what engine does it have on it? The big question now is that engine. And so, John, I want to go to you. One of the options that's being pursued to replace the RD-180 is Aerojet's AR-1 engine that's in development. So can you give us an update on the status of that engine and your views on whether it would be most effectively used on the Atlas 5 as close to a drop-in replacement, or if it would be better used on a new launch vehicle that's been proposed, the Vulcan?
Sure, again, Todd, thanks a lot. The engine question feeds right into the launch vehicle, into the service. I mean, you all have touched the key points. Certainly, we would offer that we think AR-1 is the lowest risk, fastest path, and the cheapest way to go to end Russian reliance. I think that's the start point. And the prior panel, they were talking a lot about, we have a lot of discussion about what might be, but at the end of the day, there's a bunch of no kid around operational requirements. And as long as you're dependent on Russian engines, that's a vulnerability that we ought to eliminate as quickly as we can. Like Bill touched on, not at the expense of everything else. But so what's the fastest path, most reliable path to do that, and then position for the kind of things we're talking about? That's what we view AR-1 with Atlas, which, when you look at the numbers, lowest cost. Atlas, or a Vulcan variant, also very low cost. Save every dollar you can for what can be. And I think when we get beyond that, and have the right kind of competition, have one that says, this is no kid around operational national security space assured access. So I want to see a proper down select. I want to see a certified production capability and do that. And then give yourself the time to let the Air Force take this great space enterprise vision they're working on, translate that into not a linear answer, because do we just want 2 launch providers? maybe for the heavy mission, but for that low intermediate class, let's look at what Blue brings, what SpaceX brings, what ULA brings, what Sierra Nevada brings with Dream Chaser, other folks that are out there. I mean, we talk a lot about AR1 in this context, but we do reusable engines, we do expendables. The other piece is that whole explosion in additive plus the hypersonic and in-space capabilities, advanced solar electric, nuclear. What do you want to do to, we were talking yesterday, or listening to some panels yesterday about the equation of the outcomes you want and bring them back in and have that robust launch market. The last piece I'd leave you with, General Goldfein has been saying this last couple of Air Force Chief of Staff, which it so applies to what we're doing now. He said, you know, when we're confronted, and the example, someone must have given him a question about an adversary from the East. He said, you know, a global power doesn't have a linear response. They have a response, if it comes to the East, they have a response from the North, South, East, and West. And they do it at a speed with capabilities and multiple dilemmas, and that's deterrence in its own right. So, you know, when I listen to that, and I listen to our launch discussion, can't we get that discussion there? So let's solve the Russian vulnerability problem. Let's do it in the lowest cost way, save those dollars, and use them for the kind of things we're talking about. And there's a lot of capabilities that in the next few years, I think we're talking 3 to 5, probably 5 to 8 to prove out.
So follow up quickly. Yeah. So in terms of the development timeline on AR1, where are you right now? You know, where are you going to be? FY22, of course, is when we're supposed to totally end RD180. Are you going to have a fully operational certified engine by then?
Yeah, Todd, thanks for the question. We're on the path we laid out 2 years ago on schedule. We'll have a certified engine coming off, it'll be a production engine coming off a production line, which we have outside of Los Angeles right now, in 2019. And depending on the pace of integration with ULA and the pace they're moving on with Vulcan or an Atlas, it's ready for integration. The work can start ahead of that, but it's a 1920 proposition.
Okay. And so, Brett, I want to go to you. Basically, the same question. The other option that's being pursued right now for RD-180 replacement engine is Blue Origin's BE-4 engine, which was already being developed by Blue Origin for a different launch vehicle, the New Glenn. So could you give us an update on the BE-4? What's its status? And in particular, what are the long-term plans for this engine, not just potentially on the Vulcan, but also on the New Glenn?
Sure. It's funny listening to John because I think we have exactly the same talking points, you know, fastest path, lowest cost, and lowest risk. So we have the BE-4 engine. We shipped our first engine from our manufacturing and design facility in Kent, Washington. We shipped it a couple weeks ago down to our Texas test site, and it's on the test stand now. We have set up our production line. We have a production line for our BE-3 hydrogen engine, which we've flown 5 times to space and back, executing a landing of our new Shepherd vehicle down in West Texas. So, you know, we've got that capability. We're very excited to be getting into the full engine test phase. We've been doing component tests for the last 3 years on it. We've done over 220 stage combustion tests. We've done a couple hundred power pack tests. We've done all sorts of bearing tests and, you know, everything else that goes into the engine itself. And so we're at that point where seeing the first assembly on the test stand is very exciting. So hot fire for that coming up soon. And we have a long qualification plan, development test and qualification plan that we have to go through to prove that engine out. So we're excited about that. As you mentioned, we were developing that engine first for our own purposes. United Launch Alliance came along at just the right time where we were able to shift the sizing of the engine from a 400,000 pound thrust engine to 550,000 pounds of thrust, which gives them more than enough capability to not only meet the 9 reference orbits that the national security community has, but to do it at a cheaper price point than they were with the RD-180, because not only is the engine cheaper, but they get more capability out of the first stage, and therefore they don't have to have as many solid rockets on the rocket at the same time. So it gives them better performance at a lower cost, and that helps them be competitive in the marketplace, both commercially as well as for the national security launch community. When you step back from that and you look at the state of space launch, particularly around national security right now, it's deja vu all over again, in the sense that every 5 years we go through this existential crisis on space launch, and something fundamentally changes. So we went through it in the early 70s when we got rid of Saturn V and went with the Space Shuttle. We went through it in the middle 80s when the Space Shuttle Challenger accident happened, and we took national security payloads off of a dedicated shuttle. And then it happened again in the early 90s when we went through the EELV program creation. I worked on the Space Launch Modernization Plan with General Moorman back in the 1994 timeframe. And then we had the big commercial run-up at the end of the 90s, created the EELV program, came up with 2 independent systems, which, by the way, was a great deal for the government at the time. It's $5 billion worth of vehicle development, and the government put in $1 billion, which was only 20% of the funds. Flash forward 5 years, and the commercial market disappeared, and the government had to step in and say, we will pay you to maintain both lines, and it shifted from a government leveraging commercial to a government having to pay for it all. And then United Launch Alliance with Atlas and Delta became an only government provider. The commercial market went away as the government requirements became the driver for everything. And that is, ULA is really just a reflection of their government customer and how that process drives them to a certain mission assurance level, capabilities, and frankly, oversight process that the competitor that's coming in doesn't have to deal with. So there isn't a level playing field, there isn't apples to apples. When you talk about the cost of the GPS-3 mission, for example, that SpaceX just won at $95 million or something, they don't have to have a heavy capability. They don't have to have the infrastructure that provides those other capabilities that ULA has provided and has built their cost model around. And so only when those 2 entrants have to compete on a level playing field would you be able to decide based on lowest price technically acceptable. You can't do that today because it's not apples to apples. And yet some of those competitions really do look that way. As you go forward, if ULA is going to be legislated out of using one of their engines and forced to compete, then there's an obligation, I think, from a national security perspective to maintain an environment where that secret sauce is not lost. They could go away easily, and we would lose something. We would be back to a monopoly for the time being, but also we would lose that heritage that we've had for 50 years of Atlas and Delta and the heritage companies that have had that mission assurance success rate. So it is a precipitous time for national security launch, but it always is. And the question is, we went from fully commercial to fully government. Where is that sweet spot? What is the happy medium going forward? And it is a delicate issue that needs to be decided very carefully.
Okay, so I know there are probably a lot of questions in the audience here, so I'll go right to the audience to start answering questions. So we've got microphones around the room, so if anyone wants to raise their hand, we'll bring a microphone your direction. Wow, you're not going to make me ask a question, are you? All right, Russ, right up here.
Hi, Russ Matevich, Hawkeye 360. In your study, did you look at alternative ways that the U.S. government could contract for the delivery of the satellite? So rather than it going to the U.S. Air Force to launch with ULA, the SPO would contract for delivery on orbit of the spacecraft and then basically take mission assurance away from the government, put the prime contractor at risk for mission assurance, so that now you can get to an apples to apples type comparison in cost, because now it's just, you're competing on the merits of your launch technology that the primes are going to be deciding. And it's been done before in the past. The Navy UHF follow-on program used commercial delivery on orbit as their acquisition structure.
Well, I would say that I don't know that I could say we looked at exactly as you described that, but there's a couple of elements there that we absolutely looked at in our Beyond RD-180 study. The first is, again, if it's a service, there's a lot of implications that flow from that. In a truly service acquisition model, you don't specify nearly any of the items that have historically been specified by the government when launching government national security, particularly payloads, of which mission assurance is one of the central features. Now, not to say you couldn't have a mission assurance requirement in your service, but you generally, it's more of an insurance model, right, that says if you fail in providing the service, then there's an indemnity of some kind is owed. The second piece of it is we do touch on the fact that if you don't have a common model, the easy way to describe that is a level playing field, then you're not going to have a successful competition. You're going to have to go to some other way to generate a form of competition. And in the near term, one of the things we talk about in the near term, because of the path dependence of how we got to where we are today, there is not a clear, easy way to say, okay, I'm going to compete ULA and SpaceX on an equal basis. Totally even playing field, same contract type. In theory, the competitive contracts that are out there are commercial contracts. It's the same contract for both, but there's a lot of legacy cost, a lot of legacy structure built into the business model of the two competitors. You can't just wish that away. It's still there. The third thing that I would say, getting to our other study on the, if you will, the grand vision, low-cost access to space, is that that vision is achieved when you really have a commercial service, fully robust commercial market out there. And so we do talk a little bit about how, if that's the goal, if that's the objective, that's the grand vision, as Bill described, most everyone has, you need to think about how do you get there. You have to set up structures that allow you to behave that way. And that definitely means moving towards a more commercial type model for acquiring launch.
I just want to add something Andrew said real quick on the service thing. So again, I think I'm a proponent of buying it as a service, but there's two interesting things I can show that we as government custodians of taxpayers' money still get held accountable for, even though it's a service. One is the Russian engine. So the Russian engine is a subcontractor, I think, to a subcontractor to somebody we're buying, the CULA, we're buying a service for. Do you think that mattered to the Hill? Here's the second part. It's bought as a commercial item. Yet the Hill was saying to the Air Force, why are you allowing buying Russian engines at these prices? And we're like, it's a service, it's a subcontractor, and they're buying a commercial. It's not our business. It didn't matter. Okay, so that tell you, you're still held in a different standard in the government when you're buying service. The other quick one I'll say is that during the time when ULA was debating whether to bid on GPS-1, remember that, I got a call from another industry group that said, well, if they won't bid, we will. Can you give us the data rights for Atlas V and we'll put our engine on it? So I called up my friend Tori Bruno, who's the head of ULA, and said, Tori, okay, guys, what's the situation of data rights for Atlas V? He goes, don't even think about it, Bill. Because we're, so that's the point. But
Who was that called up, Bill?
So you see what I mean. When you buy as a service, there's implications.
Yeah. And, I want to ask a quick question for our industry folks here. Earlier today, Representative Bridenstine was here and gave a talk. One of the things he mentioned was the idea of an America First launch policy that could include tax credits to companies launching satellites if they use an American-made launch vehicle. Do you have thoughts on that?
Sure. If you go to the service model and you look what other folks do around the world, you can certainly build that in as a price advantage for U.S. companies. It's interesting to pile on the service conversation. You can have a service contract where you don't pay for anything until you get data or the delivered product, right? Sure. That's it. And the risk is on the provider. So there's all those kind of models. You even have folks like in Europe where UK outsourced all its military communications. I mean, there's lots of good examples out there of how far you can go. But when you get back to how do you want to spur investment, the late 90s when I first got to NASA, the discussion just finished within the Bush 1 administration about Chinese and later, Soviet and Russian launch. And the point was the golden egg was the satellite, right? It was the satellite contract. The launch was almost a wash. Right. And now you're in a market where maybe 50-50. So to come back to if you're looking at a holistic American strategy that says, I want to encourage all different parts of the sector, why not?
Any thoughts?
I want to go back to the idea, not just of a service, but about making it as commercial as possible. And obviously, I'm with a commercial company, and I believe in commercial space. But the government thumb is all over the launch industry, and you can't take that away. And we're talking about national security space here, and you've got 27 payloads in the manifest for from 22 to 27, so 6 years, 4.5 payloads a year. Those are very important payloads, and separating out some for a commercial service just makes the others get more expensive, right? It's not a big marketplace. And so it shouldn't be looked at on pure commercial terms. There's going to have to be government involvement, government management. I'm not sure if allocation is the way to do it or direct direction, but there's plenty of direction from the Congress, there's plenty of direction from the White House. And as I said, the government thumb's been all over it for the 60-year history of launch, and it will be for many decades to come.
Could I just add something?
Sure.
I'm with you on that, Brett, but part of it is what you guys hopefully are going to be gangbusters with is really creating more requirement, right? And so as you get into that, don't you get the government becomes like in other sectors, it becomes a buyer of that service. And maybe it's for example, the heavy, and we haven't even talked about how does SLS get into this whole mix, right? And how does the government drive down cost on that? Because what's clearly uniquely a government buyer, these heavy missions right now, right? And when you get into small, medium, there's more and more opportunity for commercial to come in. That's why, like with engines, if you're buying for a purely commercial provider, great, understand that, we do everyone. When you get the government customer, and that's why, I was talking about earlier, when you're talking about Air 1, BE4, are you going to go down all the things you expect for national security space or not? And that's what we're looking to when we look to the compete and talking about where we'll finish and this and that. As you get more commercial, and then people are just buying a service, and then maybe that preserve of government gets smaller and smaller in the heavy launch side.
Right. So from a Blue Origin perspective, we're building a New Glenn launch vehicle. We firmly believe that you have to grow the market, and that market is human space flight. We've designed a launch vehicle that is larger than the Delta IV Heavy. It is a heavy launch vehicle, and it's primarily aimed at the human space flight market, which does not exist. We have the luxury of doing that based on our founder and his good fortune, but we're not. At the same time, assuming that that vehicle, won't be usable for other things or for normal commercial satellite launch, which we have signed a couple of contracts for commercial satellite launches on that. When it comes to the BE4 engine, we work with the Air Force and ULA every day on giving them insight into that engine. It's fully paid for by the private sector. We're paying for it. United Launch Alliance is contributing to it. We're not dependent on government money. That's kept us able to stay on schedule and on path to deliver that engine. So we're quite confident in where we stand from an engine standpoint, because not only do we have a customer for it, but we also have a need for it ourselves.
Are you saying government money's unreliable? No, we can't pass a budget.
A very quick flip comment, but to make a point, so with apologies. Those of us in acquisition, if we wrote part A of our acquisition strategy, find a billionaire willing to throw his money at going to Mars. Check. Okay, now, you see the issue.
Absolutely.
The United States government, for its most precious national security payloads, is luckily have a couple of very rich people that want to go to Mars. At least as long, hopefully for a while.
We're not about Mars, but
Or wherever you want to go,
Right.
whatever you want to do.
Sure.
Thank you.
Sure. But the bottom line from a national security perspective is, we're developing an engine that the Air Force has complete insight into. We have a production capability that, should we get out of the business for any reason, ULA has right of first refusal to take over the factory, the design, everything else. So all those protections and mitigations can be done. If you go to a pure commercial market and you say, I'm dependent on a launch vehicle that needs a large, commercial market to survive because of the way the competition is done, then you're vulnerable in a different way, in a much more profound way.
So I'm going to ask the two guys who aren't in the space industry a pointed question. An issue that's come up recently, there's a memo from Representative Rogers recently to the Air Force. I think Chairman Thornberry signed on to it too. That basically said, I'm summarizing here, that they think that the Air Force and the Congress ought to have a say in the down select between these two engines. So I'm not going to ask you guys about this, but for Andrew and Bill, what are your thoughts? What role should the government have in the down select between these two engines?
Okay, great question. So the point being that normally the government would not be making this choice, right? Either the launch vehicle provider would make the choice, or again, if you're in a fully service model, maybe it wouldn't even be the launch vehicle manufacturer, maybe it'd be some other person in the chain who's managing the service, and it wouldn't be the government's role. Should the government intervene? Well, I'm not going to say you stumped me. I guess I would say no. Just my intellectual predilection is let industry sort these things out. Again, I'm trying to keep in mind that grand vision of where we want to go. And that grand vision of where we want to go, ultimately, and I'm not saying we're going to get there soon, but it's of a robust commercial space launch market that functions with some government involvement. We're never going to get away from that. That's a major point of our second report. But that is not that heavy thumb. It's maybe there's a pinky, but it's not that heavy thumb of the government making all of these decisions. If we want to get there, I would argue we're better off moving in that direction, which would mean not having the government make that decision at this stage.
Bill?
Yeah, I think ideally you don't want the government to make that decision, but here's the challenge. The challenge when you're sitting on the government side for national security and industry comes to you and says, you know what, if we don't get a minimum number of these launches in the next 5 years, we're out of business. Now you could say, we used to call it the blazing saddles strategy. Is that you coming in threatening to shoot yourself unless you get what you want? Or do you really, you have to kind of understand it. Is that right? Are they really in that situation or not? And that's what I always tell people about the public-private partnership idea, which is the way, my understanding is the draft RFP that was just released recently on the launch services.
Correct.
Is a public-private partnership. The idea behind it is hopefully each bidder will say, this is how much I need, government, this is how much you need to give me. And I think there's a minimum of 1/3 that the offer has to do. Right. But here's the key, the industry has to have a business case close. And so you find yourself on the government side trying to figure out the business case of these commercial items. You say, well, where's your business going to come from? And so, and then saying, are they doing a blazing saddles thing or not? Yeah. Because at the end of the day, if the government has a choice of one of these two, if we have two launch vehicles, one of them is going to go out of business, we'll do another ULA again.
Right.
We'll say, no, the government's going to intervene, and we'll do an allocation. So I think we want to go commercial, but the government has to make that hard choice.
All right, now I see a lot of hands going up.
Can I add to that real fast?
All right, and then John, I'll give you a chance to. Be fair.
The idea that the government can step in and help make that decision, if you will, or have a role and tell a company how to do its business or what engine to select or how to do that. That only works in a government-only construct where they understand that they're paying for a full capability and they're going to use that full capability, and it's not dependent on anything else. What the government has said from both Congress and the administration, at least previous administration, has been that national security space launch is going to go to competition and get off the Russian RD-180 engine. And those two prerequisites say you can't have that government-only managed environment.
right.
And therefore,
That's right.
the government, should not be dictating what a private company does to meet those obligations or to meet that. If they want to have that decision power, then they have to change the whole
That's right.
construct.
That's exactly right.
John?
I agree with almost everything Brett said. The fact of the matter is, I also think could well be misconstruing the intent of that letter. I don't think it said the government wants to be sitting at the table. I think it's a very valid role of government if it's spending a lot of its own money to say, look at the down select criteria as part of the OTA process. And, because what we've heard in the media is, and this is in discussion, but we'll do a down select based on a prototype engine test. Now, with all due respect, there's an engine that's going to be tested, but it's not an engine that will fly. Okay? There's not a factory, I understand, Brett, but I don't know.
It is an engine that'll fly. It's a flight weight engine that will fly.
It's a flight weight?
It's a flight weight engine. It's not a prototype
Good.
in that sense.
So-
Government uses the word prototype.
Yeah. Well, we have a engine process like you have, to go through a whole certification process for the government for national security space to say, I want to see that whole process, or I want to see certain steps in that process as part of a down select. I think is a very reasonable thing if you have a lot of money in the game. Okay? So, and the fact of the matter is that should be the test profile, how you're going to produce it, where you're going to, all the things we look for national security space. If that's, again, we're doing an apples to apples comparison. So I don't think that's unreasonable to ask. Now, if the Air Force, if someone else was saying, we're going to make the decision for a company, that's a different ballgame. Making sure the criteria are in place for NSS launch, I don't think that's unreasonable.
As a general rule, having people outside the acquisition chain weigh in on source selection criteria is generally a bad idea. There's usually not a good outcome there.
All right.
Well, are they source selection criteria, or is it
Yeah.
So let's go to a question up front here. There's a microphone.
Hi, Gil Klinger.
Thank you.
Hi, Bill. How are you?
It's a kill.
I guess just a couple of thoughts. I'd be interested in your views about what has to happen to the launch infrastructure in the United States to realize John Hyten's space enterprise vision. While most of the attention is going on the satellite side, on command and control side for very good reason, depending on how one thinks about the concept of resilience, I would argue that there are massive implications for the launch infrastructure, and that our launch infrastructure is completely mismatched to handle that load. The other thought I'd just offer is, notwithstanding SpaceX's catastrophic failure, for the United States government, it's been the better part of 25 years since we had a catastrophic launch failure, at which point we had 3 Titan IVs blow up, and I think a Delta as well, just for good measure. And the reason I raise that is because there are very few people left in the United States government who lived through any of that. And it's going to happen again. It's just the nature of the beast. And because this is a political process at the end of the day, whether it should or it shouldn't be, I think it's an interesting thing to think about this discussion that you've been having in the context of a catastrophic failure, whether it's a ULA failure, whether it's a SpaceX, Blue Origin. Sooner or later, we are going to have a US government payload on one of these rockets. It's going to blow up. And at that point, you all know better than I do what's going to happen at the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue. And the less involvement the executive branch, the federal government at that point, will have had in parts of the launch business, the more the volume of the outcry will be, because the Congress will act as though, what do you mean you were uninvolved? You should have known all along. So, and I don't know that there's an answer for that, or that necessarily we shouldn't necessarily make policy on the basis of the probability of a catastrophe, but launch is a little bit of a different business. So I'd just be interested in your views on those.
All right, Andrew.
Well, just a couple of thoughts on that, and I definitely don't have the answer, Gil, but I have lots of opinions. Let me, on the second point first, I do think and this is, I think, an important point in this broader discussion, that risk in the future may not look exactly the way the risk calculus looked in the past. So in the late 1990s, early 2000s, with very large government satellite payloads that are very sensitive, both in terms of what they are and in terms of the time that they need to be on orbit, yes, every failure was catastrophic, right? I mean, there's catastrophic in terms of a catastrophic failure of a rocket on launch, and then there's catastrophic in terms of catastrophic implications for the US government. So we may have catastrophic rocket launch failures in the future that aren't actually catastrophic from a government perspective, because it may be 10 satellites, which we can go 3 months later and launch 10 more. And so I do think that for that kind of a launch, right, I've got a higher risk threshold if I'm an intelligent government customer. And I think we're moving more towards that model. I would argue the market is moving pretty quickly in that direction. Now, there's still going to be those really, truly ultra-sensitive payloads, and that gets to what Bill touched on, is that there are risk calculuses within the space launch portfolio that are not the same across all satellites. And in an allocated competition model, or in what I tried to call IDIQ competition model, which I'll confess is a little confusing, you can take those into account, right? And you can say, I'm going to award some of my launches on this basis, other launches more on a price basis. Your first point about infrastructure, I think, is a really good one, in that, again, if we get to the grand vision of a robust commercial space launch market, we don't have the infrastructure to support that right now. So how do you get there? And I do think that there is a lot. The government, by necessity, will have a very big role to play, perhaps on the investment side, but certainly on the, on the permitting side, and maybe even on the design side, because the history of launch infrastructure has been relatively low launch rates. Saw an article last week, I think, that Cape Canaveral is looking to do 48 launches this year, which I think would be a record. And so we're already moving towards a much higher launch rate, and that's probably going to require some changes to launch infrastructure.
So, 2 quick points also at the same point. And Gil, you know this. First is a flip comment, like I always have to make, and then the second is a serious one. The flip comment is when I used to get told that space launch was too expensive, and we had how many successful launches in a row, I'd say, okay, let's start lowering the price each launch. Once we get the failure, we know the exact price. Then we got it scientifically determined. The second, more serious point is when I look at the manifest as I remember it, and I look at how much each of those satellites cost. I'm not talking about in the far future. I'm talking the next 4 years. It's in the hundreds of millions, at least dollars, sometimes more. And you have to think about it for a second, is we're having competition that the winner's winning by tens of million or maybe even less. So I do want to, at interesting conversations, going to say, you awarded a contract because this was $10 million less than that and we lost a $700 million satellite, if that happens. So it's your point.
And Gil, you know this too, but I'll say it anyway. It's that, this service model we have now where you're looking for a provider that can do everything. Is that the right model too? Do you break off those very expensive satellites at one end and free up the other part of the market? And then look at other capabilities, which we're having a circular conversation about the same kind of launches and not what could come from all kinds of things.
When you talk about the space enterprise vision and General Hyten's vision on that, I think the problem is we don't have diversity of providers, we don't have diversity of capabilities, we don't have diversity of geographic locations for launch. So we're incredibly vulnerable in that future world. One hopes that in that future world, the launch market is substantially different because of other activities like greater human space flight, greater numbers of other activities, and that diversity multiplies. But looking at it today, we're vulnerable from those perspectives.
Yeah, the air launch, all kinds of things.
So we are almost out of time here. I'm going to go to one last question. Is there a question up here? Oh, okay. I see one back in the corner back there on the back wall.
Hi, Courtney Albin with Inside the Air Force. I just had a couple cleanup questions for Brett on BE4. You said the hot fire testing is supposed to happen soon. Can you give us a better estimate on when that's happening? And I thought that was slated for late last year. So is that behind, or is that on track with what you guys were planning? And then just one other quick question: what is your cost estimate right now for the engine?
Okay, let's see. No comment, and no comment. Just kidding. The engine is on the test stand, and hot fire testing will be coming up. I can't give you a date on that. It depends on a lot of things, but there'll be more to announce when we have something to announce. In terms of price on the engine, we've negotiated prices with United Launch Alliance. They're very pleased with the price that we've put out there. They claim that it saves them significantly over what they pay now for RD-180s, or what they were paying at the time for RD-180s, and that it makes them much more competitive. So beyond that, I don't have anything additional for you. Thanks.
Okay. All right. Well, we are a little bit past our time, and so I want you to join me in thanking the panelists for a great discussion here.
Thank you.